Alcibiades is one of Plato's Socratic dialogues, and the thesis which this dialogue defends, I think, can be considered quite fundamental to Plato's philosophy. Here, however, I want to argue that the argument used throughout the dialogue fails, that it isn't even an argument at all, in fact, but rather what we call a false analogy, which is a kind of sophism or fallacy where an analogy whose validity isn't demonstrated is used to illustrate a position, but then also used as if it was an actual argument or an actual justification for the position being defended. So, for a bit of context, the Alcibiades is a dialogue between Socrates, the wise Socrates, and a young Alcibiades, who is a rich, well-educated, charismatic, smart Athenian who is just coming of age and is about to start his political career. So Socrates comes to him and is worried. Socrates is worried because he's afraid that Alcibiades might use his advantages to lead in an unreflected way, or worse, even for his own personal gain, or just grabbing power for the sake of power. So Socrates comes to Alcibiades and tests him. So Socrates asks questions of Alcibiades, questions which are designed to force Alcibiades to admit that he doesn't know what makes him especially fit to be the leader of Athens. Socrates, for instance, will ask, if you need new shoes, you go see the shoemaker, right? If you if you want to learn music, you find a music teacher. And he uses many more examples like that. He talks about divination or medicine. He also talks about shipbuilding or seafaring. So Socrates is asking Alcibiades, what are you going to advise the Athenians about? Certainly not about, for instance, what we have here, shipbuilding, right? Or medicine or such. And of course, Alcibiades says no. So Socrates asks him, so what are you going to be advising the city about? And eventually Alcibiades has to admit that he talks about wars and whatever we would consider politics, right? Which might not have been a very well-defined domain at that or sphere of action at that time. And eventually Alcibiades has to admit, yeah, I wanted to show or tell Athens and the Athenians what is the right thing to do and what they should not be doing. So what's the wrong thing to do? But then, of course, Socrates is now able to ask Alcibiades, how come you know what is good and what is bad? How come you are able to distinguish the two? Where did you learn to do that? And then that's where Alcibiades starts fumbling, right? He says, I might have learned it from my parents, he says, or from everybody at some point, he starts saying, about from the public. Socrates can say, well, if the public taught you what is good and what is bad, that means that the public knows what is good and what is bad. But if the public knew, if people in general knew what is good and what is bad, they wouldn't have to fight over it, right? They wouldn't argue over it. And yet that's all that they do. Besides, if the public knew what is good and what is bad, they wouldn't need Alcibiades' advice, right? So then Alcibiades starts saying, maybe I learned it naturally in some way. But that again fails. And again, we come back to this supposed argument of Socrates in a dialogue, where we understand where Socrates is coming from. He wants he wants not only for Alcibiades to realize that he hasn't learned the good and the bad, but ultimately, maybe more importantly, and yet in the dialogue still sort of implicitly, he wants Alcibiades to realize that in order to be able to um, make good decisions, in order to be able to choose the good, you need to know the good. You need to have learned what is good, um, explicitly learned to distinguish the good from the bad, as if there was some sort of and this is one of the hallmarks of Plato's, at least Plato's later thinking, um, or more quintessential Platonic teachings, that there is such a thing as the good in general, right? And that it can be known, and that in fact it must be known in order to really be able to choose the good. But you see, the analogy here between different crafts or abilities or practical kinds of knowledge, like shoemaking or medicine or divination or whatever, or shipbuilding or seafaring. The analogy presupposes that like ethical doing is the same kind of activity, same kind of practical activity, where um, the goals are clear, and the conditions, in this case the conditions of the good, are or can be generally defined. But this is where the argument fails, because never in the dialogue does Socrates make any effort to show that doing the good is the same kind of thing as leading or piloting a ship. What I find interesting here, one thing that I find interesting here is that there is this is supposed to be at least a rather early dialogue of Plato, where he perhaps, is coming to his own philosophy, um, but is still beholden somewhat to what maybe is the more original Socratic philosophy. So he's still using Socratic language. And here we see this. In this quote here, we see that, because Socratic wisdom, the whole idea of the Socratic wisdom, was a kind of negative wisdom, whereby recognizing your ignorance, um, you that's how you show your wisdom. And that's why you need now to discuss and reflect. And this is why we need the Socratic dialogue, because um, once you recognize your ignorance, then you're open to discuss what should be done, what really is good, instead of just relying on your preconceived opinions, right? But then here, Plato has started twisting this in a way, because originally originally this admission of ignorance wasn't just the first step to some kind of true knowledge about what should be done. It was also a deeper kind of humility, where we recognize that we can't really know definitively what is good or what is bad, but we can reflect upon it. Um, and that's the Socratic task, the positive task of Socratic wisdom. But here with Plato, suddenly um, the recognition of ignorance is only the starting point to then find out the true good, as if this was possible, as if positive wisdom about what is good, general knowledge of what is good, was possible. But that, in a way, even though it starts sounding, maybe it starts with Socrates in a way, I think betrays the original Socratic humility. This is where I stop. Thank you.